I'll drink to that.
Good afternoon, Goodspeed Instagram, and welcome to I'll Drink to That. We'll play a little theme song.
I'll drink to that.
Goodspeed's live. Oh no! See, this is why I can't play sound cues right off the top. I'm not adjusted. I'm not comfortable yet. But welcome to I'll Drink to That. Goodspeed's live broadcast happening every Monday here at 5 on Instagram. We're so happy that you are joining us today for a very exciting topic, few small changes to the broadcast for those of you who are around and staying with us each week, which is great. We love it. I'm going to go ahead and pop around to the other side as I do each week to welcome Annika Chapin, Goodspeed's resident dramaturg and artistic associate. And she should be joining momentarily. Annika, are you there? Quite, almost. Are you there, Annika?
I'm here.
How are you?
I'm okay. I got these new blue light glasses.
Oh, that's great.
Good if you're looking at computers all day. So that's the new thing in my life.
Camera, per the usual. I need to adjust my camera. So Annika, would you like to tell the people what our topic is today?
Yes, indeed. So we figured, since last week we had talked about all the lady divas of Broadway, that this week we would talk about some of the leading men of Broadway, and who are our favorites and who are the greats.
I was gonna say I have a list. I developed a little list. But this is a lot harder for me than last week. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but it's so much harder for me to define what a leading man is versus like a diva. Because even the diva is like a broad term that we use to describe a lot of lady performers on Broadway. But I guess, what did you use as your criteria for a leading man?
Well, it was really hard because it doesn't feel the same, as we said. I mean, there are so many kind of classic roles in musical theater that are tour de forces for women in an unmistakable way, like your Mame and your Mama Rose and all these roles. But the male ones are not as prevalent and not quite the same kind of like larger than life. It's hard to think of the shows that are really like showcases for a male performer in the same way that the women's roles are showcases. I mean, there's like your Billy Bigelows which is kind of like the musical theater Hamlet,
right?
But it doesn't feel quite the same. So as a result, I think we don't quite have the same like roster of personalities that are like you can just say one name and it's like, obviously, I mean, there's a few which we'll talk about, but it's definitely a different phenomenon, and it's really interesting because it's like the opposite of pretty much every other industry.
It really is. It's so odd because, unlike the divas, and this is kind of like what you said, but as I was like going through and trying to come up with a list so we could do like a top 3 and some honorable mentions, it's hard for me to divorce leading men from from one role than it is like I can think of Bernadette Peters in a vacuum and all the things that she has done and her different roles. It's harder for me to do that for the leading men of Broadway. It's still it's a different beast because like I think like I found myself, I don't know about you, as I was going down and making my list, like I was like, well, what are some of my favorite shows and like who originated that role? And then it's like, oh, they really have such an odd career. It's not as I don't know, it doesn't track as linearly. I don't know that that's the right way to put that, but did you find yourself kind of doing the same thing?
Yeah. And then it was a little bit harder to kind of define like, well, this is a person who's like in a lot of shows, but does that make them like, this? What about the comedy guys? Is someone like Nathan Lane in this category? Or
Nathan Lane was the first name I wrote down. Yes.
Yeah. So it's a little bit trickier.
So let's do kind of what we did last week. For what's your number 3? If we're gonna go from 3 to 1, what would be your number 3? I'm staring at my list trying to decide what my number 3 would be. So what would be your third favorite leading man? And please, those who are viewing, please feel free to comment some of your favorite leading men. We'll be happy to discuss them. Some of them might even make our combined list. So what's your number 3, Annika?
Okay, so with the caveat that this is hard, and it's funny, even as I'm thinking this, I'm like, oh, Danny Burstein, is he a leading man? Like,
he was on my list too.
But like, qualifies quite because he's like more of a character. Anyway, so this is by no means complete, but I would say, yeah, no, we just got a good comment that I'm so glad we'll talk about in a second. Number 3 for me.
Yeah. Paul Alexander Nolan. What a bless. What a bless. Right.
Yeah.
So,
the voice, abs, the beautiful man. Number 3 for me, I thought, you know what? I can't have anyone on this list. Like when I think of like the male musical theater part,
mm-hmm.
It is Sweeney Todd for me. So I was like, okay, so if I'm going to say that Sweeney Todd is the part, who is the guy, then in my heart is always Sweeney Todd. And I have to give it actually to George Hearn.
Okay.
Is my Sweeney. I know he's not the original. Len Carey was the original, but there's that concert version that he did with Patti LuPone. And this is my favorite. I love that one. I just love him. So I'm going to give it to George Hearn. Also for his Alban.
Yes.
Yep. And what a voice, that guy like unhooks his jaw and like this like crazy powerhouse comes out. So I love George Hearn.
And now am I mistaken that George Hearn was actually the Sweeney that was filmed from the original production? Did they film I feel like they filmed George Hearn because it was later. I don't know. I could be really wrong on that.
No, that sounds familiar. That does
because
sound.
I think of George Hearn when I think of Sweeney Todd, and I think that's why.
Yeah. I think that might be right. I wonder if somebody in the comments can confirm. But
I was going to say, if someone in the comments wants to confirm that, I would be great.
Yeah. My dad has confirmed it with a yes. Thanks, Dad.
Ted Chapin, thank you. Always there for us. I'll drink to that, Ted Chapin.
Yeah. Which is funny because that seems to happen more often then. I mean, I feel like with Company too, that by the time they recorded the album, it was a different Bobby.
Yeah, well, and that's the whole like before.
Yeah. Dad says it was filmed in L.A.
Oh, interesting.
Didn't know that either.
So I wonder, was that so interesting? Well, maybe we'll have to bring your dad on a special guest and ask about it. But George Hearn is totally fair because I think of him as Sweeney Todd. Back to your list, I think that's a great choice, and he didn't make my list of contenders, but I did think about him. So yeah, fair. I feel like we're going to have a lot of the same ones as we've already. I like you say certain things. I'm like, oh gosh, is she going to pick the one that I'm about to pick? So I'm staring at my list. I think that my number 3, I'm going to go for Norm Lewis because I adore Norm Lewis. I think he's massively talented. I kind of don't think he gets all the credit he deserves. I think he's an unsung hero on Broadway. I think he's so fantastic. And I actually, I'll go ahead and give myself a take for this take. The Porgy and Bess revival, I thought he was the best part of it. I thought he should have gotten the Tony and not Audra. If you're going to give one of them a Tony, I would have given it to Norm Lewis. And I think that's a little bit of a take, so I'm going to play myself that.
All right.
I'll drink to them.
Then I have to say,
it's a bit of a take, but I do. Oh, and I see Grace commenting that I did not see Norm Lewis in Music Man at the Kennedy Center, but I heard stories.
Yeah, Norm Lewis is definitely worthy of this. His voice is like angel music.
Oh my God.
Warmth in human form. And he's the nicest guy also, which is always a nice thing. Although I would say,
I love him in that Les Mis concert, the 25th anniversary concert as Javert. I think he's fantastic.
Well, see, this is the thing. I was about to have a hot take.
Go for it.
When they did this revival of Les Mis that they did, where they just brought back, and to me, it was kind of weirdly cast across the board, but I ached because I was like, why would you have Alex Gemignani and Norm Lewis and not have Norm Lewis? I mean, I know why. They didn't want to have Norm Lewis play Valjean because I think there was probably concern that if you had like the constantly persecuted black man by the white man, it kind of takes on a different tack. But to me, like there's something about Alex Gemignani that's kind of vulpine and like more suited to Javert naturally, and there's something about Norm Lewis that's so like he just radiates goodness in a way that I'm like, you're having them both play against type in a way that was tricky for me. I would love to see his Valjean. I want to see him sing it. I mean, the whole thing.
That's
So
so interesting. I'm gonna go ahead and play you another vodka stinger for that one.
Another vodka stinger. I'll drink to that.
That's a long one. But I think yeah, it's interesting. I don't think of Normalist, like I don't think of him singing Jean Valjean. I don't find that as satisfying as I do his Javert, but I don't know. That's it. I'll have to keep thinking about that.
yeah, for me, it's less about the voice quality because they're both amazing
Right.
singers, and just about the sort of personality quality.
The type. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
interesting. Very interesting. Okay, so who would your number two be then? Who's your number two leading man?
Okay, I had to split this into two, but I feel like even though I'm cheating a little bit, I can still get away with it,
Okay.
which is the Bryans. Brian Darcy James and Brian Stokes Mitchell.
Okay.
Because I think that they are both like of our time, two of the unquestionable leading men. And actually, weirdly enough, I found it much easier to find contemporary versions of this. And I don't know if it's just that I'm not as knowledgeable about the older ones, but it felt to me like it was very easy to identify the the Michael Cerveris, the like these guys now who play a lot of these roles. But anyway, so Brian Stokes Mitchell and Brian Darcy James, mostly because I just couldn't decide between them as well. I think they're both amazing. Ooh, Greg Van Acker is coming with Anthony Warlow. That's also
that's a great one, Greg. That's a great one.
Yeah, his voice is magical.
Yeah, we love him. We showed him on the podcast too, actually.
Yeah, we do. And the Annie one because he played Daddy Warbucks, and I wish he had a more auspicious Broadway debut because he would just take it over the world. Yeah, Brian Darcy James is amazing because I think he's a performer who can be everything from kind of sneaky and sleazy and villainous to the most authentically decent man you've ever seen in the whole wide world. And then also he is astoundingly funny, with no disrespect to anybody who played the role, including the people who played it on Broadway originally. I will never see a better King George in Hamilton than Brian Darcy James. I think that part was like so owned by him from this. I mean, his face alone when he came out playing King George was so funny without saying a word. So I have to give it to him, but also Brian Stokes Mitchell is kind of a throwback. He's like the most elegant, the most sophisticated, like just, that voice is glorious. He can play a lot of those parts that it's hard to find people to play because they don't, I mean, this is a terrible thing to say, but like they don't make him like that anymore. You know, they don't make him in that kind of like, he's a gentleman. There's something about like emanates this sort of elegance, and that's kind of hard to find, not to mention that he's just so talented. So I split my vote just because they have the same first name, which is not fair, but I did it anyway. And they're also both, again, the loveliest, nicest people. Brian Stokes Mitchell is singing The Impossible Dream outside his window every night at 7 to honor the healthcare workers. Brian Darcy James, when you talk to him, it's like no other person exists in the world.
Yes.
He's amazing. So they're both really lovely. So I'm very happy to put them as number two.
That's okay. So it's so interesting. I'm gonna hop on and discuss a couple of things about it because it's so interesting. Step one, it's interesting that you brought up that you had a harder time thinking of older people. You found it easier to do younger people or like more current people. I actually found myself in the opposite realm, that I was having a really hard time with current people, and I kept going like way back. I felt like I was in the way back machine with some like the names on my list. So I actually, and it's, now, and because you split it, now I'm tempted to split it, but I'm also terrified that we're going to have the same, that you're going to say number one, that's going to be my number one.
I think it's probably true, but I think it's also fair, and I have my defense also.
For your number one, or for your splitting?
For why it's okay that we both have the same number one.
Oh, okay. So I think, I'm gonna take a page out of your book. I think. Oh no, I can't. I can't do it. I can't. Okay, I'm gonna do my number two. I'm gonna do my number two as Nathan Lane.
Okay.
Because, but that's so hard because I think I'm leaving off. Am I gonna make that one my number one? Okay, I'm gonna make Nathan Lane my number two because I think he's an incredible performer, incredible actor. I love that revival of Something Happened on the Way to the Forum. I think his Nathan Detroit is absolutely amazing. The producers, I mean, I could go on and on and on about how fantastic a performer I think Nathan Lane is. So I'm going to give my number 2 to Nathan Lane. That's my number.
Yep. He's certainly, I mean,
he's not the leading man in the sense of like we always think about leading man in the same vein as the Bryans or as the Norm Lewis's. That whole, he doesn't have that like big baritone voice that's gonna do Kiss Me Kate. But I find him so versatile that I'm picking Nathan Lane. I'm not upset about it.
Yeah. And Greg makes a great point here, which is that he disappears into every single role, and he looks pretty iconic, so it shouldn't work, but it does. He says,
really true. It's really true. This is not a musical example. Sorry, this is not a musical example, but his in Angels in America, I did not expect that to work, and for me, it worked. I thought it was absolutely wonderful.
And I have to give him a shout out too. He's currently on a show right now called Penny Dreadful: City of Angels, which is on Showtime, and he's playing a cop in the 1930s, I think. And he's, and it's funny, it's a television performance, and Nathan Lane we think of as being kind of larger than life in that way that a lot of Broadway stars are, but he can bring it really down too, where it's really subtle, it's great. My friend Carrie Bechet is also on that show. Shout out to Carrie Bechet, she's so good. Yeah, he's amazing on that, says Greg. He really is.
And because you're right, he is so broad and he is so big, but when he chooses to be subtle, and when he is subtle, I shouldn't say when he chooses, when he is subtle, it absolutely blows my mind. It blows my mind every time, which makes me, for me, it then justifies the larger than life aspects of him. Like, it's not just a shtick, it's like he's doing it with a purpose and with a reason. Absolutely,
and it's a mark of skill. It's a difference between talents and skill, where it's like, some people, like Ethel Merman, as much as we love her, was always big.
Yes.
And granted, television and film was very different then, so it's not exactly like she was called on to do the kind of work that you have if you're doing contemporary television stuff. But like being able to kind of calibrate your performance for a camera that's a foot away from you from something that's on the back of the house, it's really a skill. He's a great choice.
Totally. Okay, so who should we do your number 1, or should we vamp a little bit longer and talk about some honorable mentions who are not going to make the cut for you? Let's talk about honorable mentions first.
Yeah, let's do some honorable.
Let's do that.
Yeah.
So who are a few of your honorable mentions? They didn't make your list. Maybe they made my list or might still make my list, but who are some of your honorable mentions?
I mean, I think I've seen some of them coming up in the comments. I think Raul Esparza is a really great choice. I mean, Raul Esparza, who is someone who the very first time I see him, I will never forget it. Because it was such a weird, he had been cast as Riff Raff in the revival of Rocky Horror, and he did I think it was Broadway on Broadway performance. It was this thing where they set up a stage in the middle of Times Square and everybody, and he came out and he sang the Time Warp. They did Time Warp, and it was like one of those cases where I was like, whatever I was doing and like watching this in the background, and this person came out and I was like, who is that? Like Raul Esparza has that kind of like, what is that? He's got some juju, and he played, we talked about in the, I can't remember. Oh yeah. In the Retire Your Jersey, we talked about the replacements for Alan Cumming. He was a replacement. I mean, I don't think he did it on Broadway. I think he did it on the tour, but he was an MC and he has that same kind of like dirty, sexy juju that he has. So he's a one. Michael Cerveris, another one. Very intense performer. I think kind of marked by his intensity, I would say. But when he's right, he's perfect, and sometimes a little too intense for me, but but like then you can keep on going. Like Christian Borle was one that I debated because I love him. I love him as a performer, but he's a comedian, and so is that different? I don't know, but he doesn't have to be a comedian. And then you go old school to the like Alfred Drake's, anyway, it just you start to spiral. But in the older school ones, it's interesting because no, that's not true actually. Anyway, I was thinking like a lot of the iconic roles that we know were marked by like performers nailed that role, but not other ones. So like the Ezio Pinzas, Yul Brynner a little bit like that.
Yul Brynner, Robert Preston. I mean, Yeah,
We're
yeah,
getting a
yeah.
shout out for Terry Mann too, who's a really great example of like a true triple threat dancer,
Yep.
actor, and singer.
Yep.
Also, someone I had a crush on when I was a kid, and he played the Beast, which I should talk to my therapist about, I guess.
I mean, listen, you're getting an I'll drink to that for that.
I'll drink to that.
That is, wow. You
Words.
maybe just talk to your therapist about that. I'm kidding.
Props.
But not.
Yeah. Oh, Ben Vereen, that's another great one.
Ben Vereen's a great one. Michael Cerverus, I think, is going to end up in my honorable mentions. Because he was one of the ones I was debating about putting in number one. But I think he's going to end up in my honorable mentions. I particularly love Fun Home. I think Fun Home is such a special piece of theater, and he was so incredible in that. I also love him. I love his Sweeney, and I love a lot of what he brings to the table. But he'll make my honorable mentions. Some of the old school names that are going to make my honorable mentions. I'm holding my Mary Poppins cup, and he's not booking it for Mary Poppins, but Dick Van Dyke for Bye Bye Birdie back in the day. Just delightful. I almost split. This is what I was debating splitting. My second one, and my justification for splitting it, but I didn't end up, was a split between Richard Burton and Rex Harrison for the Lerner and Lowe boys. Originating Camelot and originating My Fair Lady. I think those are both incredible actors and performers. So I was debating that a little bit, but they'll end up in my honorable mentions just because it's like that one. If you've only got like one that I can think of you in, I'm having a hard I have a harder time justifying those in a top three. But then of course I kind of negate that with my number one pick. I think, but the other one I'm gonna put in honorable mentions is Danny Burstein, who I think is brilliant, and I loved his Tevye. Shout out to the Tequila Sunrise Sunset that we're drinking.
I have a modified one. I don't have orange juice, so I made something with tequila, but it's not quite the same thing.
Listen, we do what we can in quarantine.
Yeah.
Although I do think, for all you loyal viewers, I do think we're going to start mixing cocktails on the show next week. That's part of my this week task. So stay tuned for that. But I think, so Danny Burstein's going to end up for Follies for so much of his for Dress Chaperone we talked about a couple weeks ago. I thought his Tevye was stunning. Danny Burstein is going to be my honorable mentions. Not going to make the cut, but a true Broadway great nonetheless, in my opinion.
Yes, and I also want to give it to two people who I think would oh my God, I'm losing my words today. Indubitably be on this list, except for they're on the Come Back to Us list, which is unquestionable leading men who are now working mostly in film and television. Which Hugh Jackman, who delightfully does come back to us periodically, but God, talk about an old school leading man. And Patrick Wilson is the one that got away.
I love Patrick Wilson, and I don't think he gets enough credit.
He does not.
It's so
funny. My husband, who's a big film and television person, but obviously not really a musical theater person, early on in our relationship, I made a reference to Patrick Wilson having a beautiful voice, and he was like, Patrick Wilson sings? And I was like, sit your butt down. I'm opening YouTube. And it was 2.5 hours later where I was like, you have to understand how beautifully Patrick Wilson sings and how well he can act those roles, because it's hard to find someone who can play the handsome leading man roles and make them rich and interesting. And all of the guys we've mentioned can do that, but Patrick Wilson really also can. And every time he's on stage again, I'm like, just Patrick Wilson, come back to us, do Carousel, please.
Oh yeah. Patrick Wilson is so it's interesting you bring up because you're right. It's a similar problem we have often with ingenues, where we don't feel like they're interesting enough or whatnot, but the good ones are, and he's really good. I honestly don't even know what movies he's been in recently. What's the horror franchise?
Yeah, he did a bunch of the Insidious. Is it called
Insidious? Yeah. Oh my gosh, my friends would kill me for having forgotten that title, because we watched all of them together, and it's a whole joke with our friend group. But that's another story for another time. Interesting, fascinating. Okay, so who is going to book your number one spot then, Annika Chapin? Who is your number one Broadway leading man?
Well, I had to think of, in the same way that we talked about the leading ladies being able to be referred to as one name, and immediately Bernadette, Patty, Ethel,
Yep. Okay, I know who you're going to
Audra.
pick.
There is really only one performer who I think is a man and who can be referred to by their first name alone, and you know exactly who we're talking about, and that person is Mandy Patinkin. He's my number one Devo.
I knew you were going to say it as soon as you said that, but I do think there's another one. He is not my number one, who is, and I should have Mandy in my honorable mentions, but the other, I would say, probably only other, maybe two, but Zero Mostel, you could call him just Zero. And
oh yeah.
Because I was like, maybe you're gonna go for like a real like historical one, but I knew you were gonna do Mandy. So tell us more about why Mandy is so special.
I mean, I think he is. It's funny because we actually, when we were watching the Sondheim birthday concert, first of all, there are a few things in the world that immediately will make me cry immediately. Like my tear ducts are just on it even before I can process it. One of them is watching Bernadette Peters and Mandy Patinkin sing anything from Sunday in the Park with George ever. I'm already weeping. You know, he's one of those Broadway performers, and I think he illustrates how much Broadway embraces this particular thing, which is that he's an odd combination of elements, you know.
Mm-hmm.
He's got this kind of like brooding quality to him, but he's got this kind of emotional openness, almost too much sometimes. He's so emotional. His voice has these like very high parts. He's got this really like present vibrato, you know. So he's kind of this mix of like very masculine and kind of dark and removed, and also like very open and stuff that we would kind of not usually ascribe to someone who's like kind of a leading man, but it all just works, and you can't take your eyes off him when he's performing. You really can't. I mean, Sunday in the Park with George, it's funny. Now I hope Dad isn't mad at me for saying this, but when we were watching this concert, and you know, my dad made a reference to like how well Sondheim wrote Sunday in the Park with George, that part for Mandy. It's just kind of like a perfect use of his qualities, you know, to make this character who's both fascinating, and everybody who comes in contact with him is just like drawn to him, but also really kind of off-putting in a way. Like it's hard to imagine anybody ever quite playing that part as well. I mean, in some ways it's kind of a Retired the Jersey one, right? Because it's like, it's hard to ever see anyone play George without imagining Mandy playing George, even though I've seen some good Georges, but it's so iconic. So, and when you think about The Secret Garden and Sunday in the Park with George and Evita, and just like Evita is another one where it's like, that's actually kind of an underwritten part. I've seen that show a lot. Doesn't feel like an underwritten part when Mandy's doing it. You know, he brings so much to it that you actually like don't really realize that part kind of goes away for a big chunk of the show in a way. So I just, in terms of like capital D Devo, I guess, but like, you know, when you're talking about like the stars of Broadway, I think it's got to go to Mandy as my number one in terms of the men.
It's super fair. Because you're right, there is like an inherent complexity to him that is endlessly fascinating.
Yeah.
That's kind of how I would sum that up, because he does bring so much. So I agree. I think it's a great choice. It's a totally great choice. So mine is a little bit of a shameless, you know, I shouldn't judge it. My number one choice is Jonathan Groff.
Oh, I love it.
Because I love Jonathan Groff. We do have the Spring Awakening podcast coming up this week, and so he's been like front of mind because we've been listening to the show and talking about it and researching it and all the things. So he's been front of mind. So it feels, in that way, I think it feels like a little bit of a cop-out, and it's also a shameless plug for our podcast, which drops Wednesday. Rate, review, subscribe in the Apple iTunes Store or Spotify. Feel free to review us and rate us and share us with your friends, because it's Musical Theater's biggest. It's the Hot Place Musical Theater. There are like major people like listening and caring, so it's kind of exciting. But I digress. Jonathan Groff is fantastic. I love him. He couldn't be cuter. His voice is like butter. He is so sweet. He's a great actor. I thought he was wonderful in Little Shop, this recent production of Little Shop. I thought he was absolutely fantastic. And even as King George, we talked about Brian Darcy James, but Jonathan Groff was a wonderful, great first Broadway King George. And I think he's really special. So he is getting my number one spot, and not just because I am attracted to him.
That's fair.
So, yeah, Jonathan Groff sauce.
Groff sauce.
Yeah, go for it.
I was just, sorry, this is on a different thing. I was just kind of tangentially thinking, I've never seen Billy Bigelow that I felt like kind of like nailed it. Do you have a Billy Bigelow? Who would you cast as Billy Bigelow right now?
Right now?
Well, no. Throughout history, anyone, time and space.
See, that's really hard. I feel like this could be an entire, I feel like we could have it like a subject of this as a day.
Maybe we should. Maybe we should just
We're getting close to our time.
Yeah.
That's really hard for me. And I will say, I don't know if I should say this, I thought the casting of Josh Henry in the last Broadway revival was quite brilliant and on the money. I didn't think the performance totally got there. That's my personal opinion.
Well, it also wasn't helped by kind of the ineffable thing that you can't really control too much, which is that those two, Jesse Miller and Josh Henry, although they're both brilliant performers, had negative chemistry together. My dad is pointing out.
Listen, I was going to say, I thought he did do the tour. You're exactly right.
So I just need to go back in time and see it.
I'm sure there's bootleg somewhere.
Yeah.
Or an archive somewhere.
Yeah.
Wink, wink.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think they're actually, I think you're right. Now I'm remembering. He's on the, I think there are clips of it on YouTube. I gotta go check it out. I think. Yeah, Billy Bigelow's hard. I feel like that's I'll have to think about that because I don't know who I'd cast off the bat. At least not off the top of my head.
I'd say not only is it hard, it's the hardest. It's you got to get the right mix of things, and it's a really interesting thing. But I was going to say too, Jonathan Groff, a shout out to the Bobby Darin piece that he did 2 years ago, I think. He played Bobby Darin in a lyrics and lyricist thing that was so brilliant, and I just can't wait for it to come back because I hope it does. Because he's just so glowing. He's just the best. Jonathan Groff is a great choice.
So he's my number one. Well, I think that wraps it up. We're at time. So join us next week. Next week, do you want to tell the good people what our topic is going to be next week?
Sure, absolutely. I think next week we're going to be talking about our favorite shows of the 21st century and what we feel like are the newest members of the musical theater canon.
We'll do a top 3. We have a couple segment things that we're gonna try. A couple little tiny things we're gonna try. So we'll see you next week, live at 5 here on Instagram. One final, where we'll toast all of the leading men of Broadway. We love and adore you all. Even if you didn't quite make a cut this time, we salute you and drink anyway. So cheers, everyone. Your tequila sunrise sunset to the leading men of Broadway.
Yep. Oh, and my dad is giving us some dish. Mandy did Billy Bigelow as a BBC radio show.
I think I kind of maybe knew that too. God, now I need to go and.
You can still do it. Yeah, you could do it again. So good. And he says, interestingly enough, Darren, January 18. So who knows what that means? But we might get to see that Bobby Darin thing again.
Let's hope. All right, that wraps it up from us here on the Goodspeed Instagram. We'll see you live next week at 5.
Yeah.
I'll drink to them.